Hello everyone, my name is Darren Perrett and I'm Head of Recognition, Assessment and Pedagogy in the region. Sorry I can't be with you today face to face. I'm here today to talk to you about aligning tests to the CFR. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to be talking about a lot of the material which can be found on the following manual from the Council of Europe. It's the Relating Language Examinations to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, Learning, Teaching and Assessment. Basically, the Council of Europe produced a manual for test providers throughout the world to use so they can align their tests to the CFR. It's very useful, lots of people use it, including Cambridge. Here's a web link to it, and we'll pass this on to you later. First of all, though, we need to touch on what is the CFR. I'm sure many of you here will be familiar with the CFR. Many of you will be teachers, and so will be familiar with the descriptor levels, A2, B1, B2, etc. You'll know the differences between these levels. You'll know what students can and can't do at each level. But let's have a little bit of a history lesson into the CFR and its importance. The CFR stands for the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, Learning, Teaching and Assessment. Now, it's a large document and not light reading, I would say, but it's thorough and very, very specific to what we're looking at today. The can-do statements and the descriptors that are within the CFR document are very, very, very important and are used throughout the world. It started as a European document, and Cambridge, obviously Cambridge have been around since the beginning of the 20th century, and we have language tests which still exist since then, the proficiency test, for example. So we contributed towards the CFR in terms of placing students at a particular level. We weren't the only partners though, and there are many throughout the world. The first edition of the CFR was published in 2001, and then there's been a couple of companion volumes released since then. I won't read out what's on the screen, but you can do this by yourself. But basically the CFR document is incredibly useful, and it's something that I myself use on a regular basis. But what's inside this document? Well, here's an example of the overall oral production skills and the can-do descriptors that are within. Oral production, we mean spoken production here. As you can see, the CFR has clearly defined the levels from pre-A1 through to C2. And there are positive can-do statements at each level. For example, at A1, can produce simple, mainly isolated phrases about people and places. Does that make sense to you? Hopefully it does. Could you place a candidate at that level just based on this? Possibly not. There are other descriptors and other level descriptors associated with the CFR so that you can look in more detail. But this is the overall oral production. As you move up through the levels, up towards the C levels, which are the higher levels, you can see it gets more and more, you have to use more and more complex grammar, vocabulary, and have higher levels of fluency. For example, C1 can give clear, detailed descriptions and presentations on complex subjects, integrating sub-themes, developing particular points, and rounding off with an appropriate conclusion. What language am I using today in this presentation? Well, hopefully at least B2, but I won't be using C2. Probably not. We'll see. I hope not. I want this presentation to be understood by all. And C2 is a very high level. Not many candidates in the world reach C2. Okay, so this is an example of the CFR descriptors, and this is just 1/4 of one page of the 285 pages of the original CFR document. So as you can see, there's lots more information within this document. So if you've not read it, please go ahead and download a copy from the Council of Europe's website, freely available to download. Today's conversation, though, is about aligning tests to the CFR. So how do we take these CFR descriptors and how do we take our tests and map them or align them together? Sounds like a very simple task, but you'll be pleased to know it's not. It's a very, very complex task and includes many, many people, and we don't always get it right. And before I go into the detail, I'd just like to say that it's a very subjective thing as well. What is B1? What's the difference between B1 and B2? The descriptors are there to help us, of course, but truly, the people that know are the teachers, like yourself, who've been teaching for years, who know the differences between A2 and B1, for example. They can do it in their sleep. They understand what makes a candidate B1 or A2. Very simple. And it's those people that are involved in the process of alignment. Any new test that we develop at Cambridge needs to be aligned to the CFR. And not just at Cambridge. I would say that any new test which has an international standing needs to be aligned to a framework of some description. The CFR is a major one out there at the moment, but there are others, such as the new Chinese one, the CES. Alignment to the CFR is one of the key selling points of exams because candidates need to have evidence of language proficiency at a specific CFR level. Candidates need to be able to prove that they meet the CFR requirements for entry into educational programs, for visa purposes, and so on. Therefore, it is important that we are able to answer the questions you can see on the slide and know the grades, scores, and bands we award relate to the CFR. Alignment activities help us to decide what a pass, merit, or distinction on all of our tests means in terms of the CFR, and whether upward and downward certification on a test is valid and meaningful in terms of the CFR. I think that some of you here will be familiar with the upward and downward certification of a test, such as what we have at Cambridge. But if your test doesn't have that, no problem. But you need to know what a pass or a C grade or a merit or a B grade or a distinction or A grade, whatever you call it, means in the test. Where are these cutoffs? Where are these boundaries? How do you set them? That's what we're going to find out in today's presentation. So before we look at test alignment, we do need to look at language test validation. And at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, we use the social cognitive framework as one of our frameworks to write up our validation arguments. Validation arguments are extremely important if you want to be transparent and you want the world to see how good your tests really are. Why should a candidate take your test over somebody else's? At Cambridge, we spend an immense amount of time and effort to make sure that we have the most reliable and most valid test scores possible. Within this social cognitive framework, as you can see on the screen, there are 6 main areas. One of them is related to the alignment to the CFR. Let's go through them in order. Test taker characteristics. The demographic of the test taker. Who are the test takers? Important to know this information when you're designing the test. Context validity. So we've got linguistic demands such as lexis and grammar. You've got the performance condition, i.e. The room or the computer lab where a session is being sat. And you've got the domain of use for the language test. Where is it being used? In business, in general English, for example. Next, move on to the cognitive validity. This is about the cognitive process in a candidate's mind when they're completing the task. What do they have to do to complete the task? How do they think? What are the processes that they have to go through? What are each items tapping into? We then look at the scoring validity, and this is related to the reliability of the test scores. Extremely important. So lots of stats related to that. The next one, the consequential validity, is often overlooked, but is in fact one of the most important. The consequences for the stakeholders. Who are the stakeholders? Who are using the test scores? Is it immigration department? Is it entrance to university? Is it the library? Is it parents? Is it the student? Having an understanding of who is going to sit your test is vitally important. If you understand this, then you understand what the test is being used for and its consequences. So the test score has a consequence on a particular domain of people. Next comes the criterion-related validity. As you're probably aware, at Cambridge we have a suite of examinations. Each of them are mapped to each other. So we compare, for example, our proficiency tests to IELTS or to our business English tests or lingual skill. So we do that internally. But critically important, also to do this externally. Now, normally you can't do this with other exam providers because guess what? They're not very interested in doing this, in comparing your test with their test. However, there is a set standard, international standards that you can align to. And that, or one of those, is the CFR. So aligning tests to the CFR is just a small part of the language test validation overview here. These 6 main areas combine to make validity. There's a lot more underneath this, of course, and documentation around this is enormous. Okay, so we've just looked at, briefly, language test validation and the importance of it. We've looked at the 6 stages. But when should we carry out alignment to the CFR? Of course, it's not just a new test that needs to have a valid link to the CFR. In addition to the alignment for new products, we may need to align to new frameworks like the CSE from China. The frameworks themselves may be expanded or updated, as has been the case at Cambridge with the 2000 developments of the CFR and its new companion volumes. We also need to check and confirm the alignment of our tests when we make revisions or develop new test items or test parts. For example, our Key English test has undergone some revisions in the past few years, and that is why we have to do standard setting and alignment to the CFR again. In fact, we should be carrying out regular reviews of how well all our products align to the CFR in order to ensure the validity of all of our tests. This is in line, as we said earlier, with international best practice of the wider assessment community. This is why alignment to the CFR needs to be part of the normal product lifecycle of any exam we produce. And the same is true for other exam boards that produce language exams. Okay, now we come on to the detail now of aligning tests to the CFR. And we've talked about validity just now, but this is the validity evidence that's required for the linkage of examinations to the CFR. This diagram quite nicely illustrates the processes that are involved, high-level processes, and the stages for each step. So, for example, at the bottom, we start with the Common European Framework. So we start with the framework that you're aligning to rather than the test itself, although both are important. Familiarization is a very important step. What you're doing here is getting towards, right at the very end, you can see as if you follow the arrows through the diagram, you'll get into something called standard setting. And I'll talk about that last. But standard setting is when you obviously align cut scores and decide what is an A at B2 level, for example. Now, in order to do that, you need a group of people in a room. And again, I'll come on to more detail about this later. But you need, let's say, 20, 30 people, subject matter experts in a room to decide upon what is B2, what is C1, etc., etc. They need to know the differences at higher, lower parts of the range of the CFR there. They also need to know the tests involved as well. So they need to know the test back to front. And that's also very, very important. So we start with familiarization. This is a selection of training activities designed to ensure that participants in the linking process have a detailed knowledge of the CFR, its levels, and the illustrative descriptors. This familiarization stage is necessary at the start of both the specification and the standardization procedures. Familiarization with the CFR is equally a logical prerequisite for effective linking. It's also very good practice to assess and report how successful this familiarization training has been. If you have people who do not understand the CFR and they are your subject matter experts, then you have a problem. And also about if they don't know the test, that's also a problem. So it's all about making sure that the people that are involved in this process are the experts and truly know what they're talking about. Next, we've got two specification stages, really. We've got the specification off to the left. And this is really like a self-audit of the coverage of the exam content, the task types, and how they align to the CFR. So which task types are being used for which levels, and basically it's if you look at a test specification document, that's what this is. It's a full document. It doesn't have to be in this case, but if you're producing it, it's better to have test specifications, because what you want by the time you get to the end, when your standard setting, is items to be consistent across many different test production stages. What I mean by that is, if you produce an item this year, you want it to be the same as the item produced next year in terms of its consistency and quality. You don't want it to be testing something different, even though the test specification said so. So you want to ensure consistency. Test specifications is the kind of book that item writers use to identify what to write, where to write, and how to write it. Good guidance, best practice. Okay, so do you have those specifications in place? Again, before you even get to standard setting, very useful to have this. You can find a lot of this information in the CFR itself as well. They have these on the appendices there, so you can always look this up. I mean, as well as serving as a reporting function, these procedures also have certain awareness-raising functions that can assist in further improving the quality of the examination concerned. Okay, and again, there are forms in the manual for aligning tests to the CFR. Specification can be seen as primarily as a qualitative method, providing evidence through content-based arguments. There are also quantitative methods for content validation that can be considered. And so you're looking at the data, the statistics coming out of the test results that you have. How consistent, how reliable are the test results? And so using both qualitative and quantitative data here. The standardization training, okay, the suggested procedures facilitate the implementation of a common understanding of the common reference levels, exploiting the CFR illustrative samples for spoken and written performance, and of course reading and listening. These procedures deepen the familiarity with the CFR levels obtained through the kind of activities in the familiarization, and assure that judgments taken in rating performances reflect the constructs described in the CFR and in the test specifications for the test that you've written. I mean, it's logical to standardize throughout training, before, during, and after, in fact. This is something which is ongoing at Cambridge and should be if you're producing tests as well. Okay, let's move on to the meaty part of this, which is the standard setting, because this is really the crucial point in the process of linking an examination to the CFR, and because it establishes a decision rule to allocate students to one of the CFR levels on the basis of their performance in the examination. Usually this takes the form of deciding on cutoff scores, and so the cutoff of what is a pass rate, and borderline performance, looking at borderline performances. It's always best to look at the borderline decisions here, what's the bottom of A2 or the top of A1, for example, rather than the middle, because that's where the crucial decisions are going to be made here. The preceding stages that we just looked at of familiarization, specification, and standardization can be seen as preparatory activities, really, to lead to valid and rational decisions. Right? More on that to come later. Okay, well, there's lots of information here in such a simple diagram, but just to recap what I've just talked about here, you start with the framework. You have a framework, then you get a group of people, and exam boards across the world differ in the size. Some do 15 people, some do 30 people, but really the key here is the quality. Now, you take people from outside and inside the organization, so they're not biased at all, and you've got a good mixture, a good pool of people to do the work. You get them familiar on the CFR, and then you standardize them on that, and they look at the specifications, and they're standardized on that as well. And you get the test scores coming through for reading and listening. So you've got the multiple choice question, for example, test results. So you look at the quantitative data, and you've got then the qualitative data coming from the panel of experts. And this is part of the standard setting procedures. Okay, well, let's move on to the next slide. So we talked about in the last slide about all the procedure steps, and I'm just going to outline this in a simple example that Cambridge have done previously in the past. Now, you don't have to follow this approach, but this is a nice method, a nice approach. And it's broken down mainly into 3 different activities, stages of activity. You've got the pre-workshop, face-to-face workshop, and then the post-workshop activities. Okay, so from the last slide, you're familiar with the familiarization activities that have to happen. Now, what can you do to do that? Well, here's an example. You can take the descriptors from the CFR. Now, how you do this, you could do it digitally, you can do it paper-based, it's entirely up to you. We still do them paper-based because it's good for people, especially in the room, but you can cut them up, sort them out, mix them up, and give them to the panel. Each person gets a stack of CFR descriptors, and they have to put them in the correct order from pre-A1 to C2, or whatever range that you're looking at. Very good exercise, and a very good exercise even for teachers outside of this alignment to the CFR. Then also a good way to do it is to look at a self-assessment of how good you really are at foreign languages. when I say you, I mean like the people on the panel. So ask them to do some self-assessment. Look at the descriptors, identify their weaknesses and their strengths, because they will know this, and then to report back on what level they are. And of course, background reading, plenty of that. There's the manual, there's the CFR documents from 2001, 2018, and 2020, plus a plethora of books out there talking about the CFR and alignments to language testing. So you do all this kind of pre-workshop, and you can do this via online like Teams, or you can just do it via the post, or whatever way you do it. Make sure that they do this beforehand, because you don't want to waste time during the face-to-face workshop. So in the face-to-face workshop, you've got the same kind of activity again, where you've got the descriptor sorting activity described in the pre-workshop activity section. Again, very useful. We do it through all the stages, like I said. And then you move on to the rating activity. And this is where you rate spoken and written performances, as well as reading and listening tasks. Okay, I mean, this is the key part of it as well. So once they understand, they're familiar with the CFR, they're able to put them in order, the levels of the can-dos. They then look at a text, for example, a reading text or a written text from a candidate, let's say, and they decide what CFR level that candidate is. So in a nutshell, that is what standardization is, and that's how you align to the CFR by doing this kind of exercise. It's more complex than that, and you need lots of people to do it, and there needs to be a ranking scale. Again, we'll come on to that in a moment, but that's the main activity here. You do that for writing, and you do audios for speaking, of course, and for reading and listening, you look at each item, and you look at the results, the statistics as well, on how many people have got it right, etc., etc. Also during the workshop, mainly at the beginning, probably the presentation of the aims, the origins, and the nature of the CFR. It's important that people understand this and understand the purpose of what you're trying to do here. You're trying to align to something. Important that you understand what its purpose really is. Okay, then after the face-to-face workshop, it's always wise to do some more descriptor sorting activity. Keep them on their toes, keep them guessing, or keep them understanding what is a level, and get some feedback as well from them to say how successful the workshop that you just held was. Because you never get it right. It's an iterative thing. You keep doing it and doing it and doing it, and get better and better and better. So what is standard setting again? You have to go through this because it's very, very important. We've looked at those suggestions of a workshop, pre-workshop activities through to post-workshop activities. But what is the process in the middle when they're looking at the text? If we think about those earlier questions where we talking about the pass marks, standard setting is a process usually in a workshop style, it doesn't have to be though, which helps us decide how much is enough. I mean, that's also very, very important. What's the borderline? The goal of standard setting is to set pass marks and grade boundaries by looking at test items, tasks, and candidate performances. And of course, there are recognized methodologies out there of how to go about this process with a selection of recommended methods depending on the exam type and skill. There are also established guidelines of what data to collect, what analysis to carry out during the standard setting process. But I just want to come back to what we call the pass mark and the kind of grade boundaries. So a pass is saying that this candidate is at A2 level. The grade boundary then is what level within that A2 level is the candidate. So just to be clear on this, when we align tests to the CFR, we're really lucky because we do have these CFR descriptors, and they tell us what it means to be proficient at a particular CFR level in a particular aspect of the language. As you can see on the slide, the differences here between B2 and C1. B2, they can produce clear, detailed text on a wide range of subjects and explain a viewpoint. And at C1, they can use language flexibly and effectively for social, academic, and professional purposes. Sometimes these can-do statements, as I said earlier, can be very difficult to interpret or to identify with the level. This comes with practice, and as good teachers, you will know this. Again, you know the difference between B2 and C1. You're able to identify that, but maybe given these words, you wouldn't be able to guess that. And I guess standard setting and anything to do with the alignment process, that familiarization activity about cutting up the CFR descriptors, these are also very, very important. So you get fixed in your mind what it is to be a B2 candidate and what it is to be a C1 candidate and what those differences are. Well, our goal when we do standard setting is to operationalize these general performance level descriptors we just saw on the previous slide. This is why we use a panel of expert judges to carry out standard setting. Standard setting, let's not forget this, it is a judgmental process. It's subjective judgmental process by experts. It requires experts to set the standards. Therefore, it's a good idea, like I said earlier also, to invite a cross-selection of panelists from internal and external to your company. Between them, the panel will have a detailed knowledge of the specific exam, the skill area, the candidates, and the CFR. It is the complementary knowledge base of the people who make up the panel. That is one of its strengths and one of its valid points. Here are some key terms from standard setting. An important concept, which we will discuss in more detail in a minute, is that of minimal competence. This minimum level of competency is defined operationally as the cut score. Remember the cut score? The level that the exam begins at. The level of the exam begins at. So A2 begins, that is the cut score. That is your minimal competence. The process of recommending the cut score is called standard setting. So the aim of standard setting is to set the cut score, or maybe a number of cut scores depending on the test. The cut score might be a pass, it might be a fail, it might be distinction, it might be A, it might be B, whatever it is, but it's aligned to the CFR somehow. You as language providers, language test providers, set the cut score. You identify what it is that your test is trying to do. This matches to the test specifications that you wrote. Your construct, what it is that you're testing. If that's clear and that's defined, and that each of the items that are written are reliably at the same level and test in focus, then you have a good chance of the standard setting being successful. The experts need to be experts. Go over that again because it's really, really important. It is a judgmental performance thing. They need to be experts. Don't just get any old teachers. This will have an effect on the final outcome and therefore the quality of the items being looked at in standard setting. There are a range of tried and tested methods which can be used in standard setting. These are either test-centered or candidate-centered. We use test-centered methods when we carry out standard setting for listening and reading exams. It is called test-centered because we look at a specific test paper or a set of items. We use a candidate-centered method when we carry out standard setting for speaking and writing. This is when we base our judgments on candidate performances. Both test-centered and candidate-centered methods may use data from IRT or rationalysis alongside panel judgments to come to the final decision. Okay, let's go on to look at the test-centered methods. For test-centered methods, an important concept is that of the minimally competent candidate. What do I mean by that? Well, the candidate who is at the minimum level of proficiency to be able to pass the test or achieve a particular cut score. Because we want to set the pass mark, we do not think about what an average candidate can do, because an average candidate will be above the level required for passing score. Depending on the method we use, our expert judges might see the test items in the same order they appear on the test, as in the what's called the Angoff method, or arranged in order of difficulty, as in the bookmark method. Again, I'll allow you to go away and research those if you wish. I won't talk about them in today's presentation. But there are lots of different methods, and it does depend on how you're approaching the test and the standard setting. Whatever method, though, is used in standard setting, an important stage of the workshop is to familiarize the judges with the method and the design of the test. Judges are also given a selection of familiarization activities to do and materials to read in advance of the standard setting, as we discussed earlier in the previous slides. They have the descriptors, they have the CFR, they have the background reading, they have the tests, they have the test specifications, they have now the methods which are going to be employed during the workshop. Lots and lots of information. As you can see, not an easy task for anyone to do. It takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. So that was test-centered methods. Now let's move on to candidate-centered methods. Candidate-centered methods look at candidate performances in speaking or writing tasks, and the judges in the panel determine the CFR levels of these performances by review of the CFR descriptors. Sometimes the candidate performances are live, where we may see live candidate writing scripts, or we might use pre-recorded speaking tests. Whatever we use though, the candidate-centered approach is by the use of judgmental panels. Standard setting can have various outcomes, and these can be both intended and unintended. Ideally, standard setting will confirm the cut score and the level of the test is as expected, as per the test specifications, and has remained stable over time, i.e. the test specifications again are doing their job. Item writers are producing items consistently the same. However, it may also show that the cut score is higher than or lower than expected, or that one of the grade boundaries within the CFR is in a different place than intended. It might show that a particular part, section, or task type is not performing as intended. All outcomes related to cut scores, boundaries, and levels are shared with whoever's making the test and revision of the test specifications. At Cambridge, cut scores were made many years ago, and so we have to review them time and time again now. It's an important process and has become part of our business as usual procedures. Each time there is a change, or every few years, we do standard setting now to ensure the quality has not changed. Because your test may not change, the items may not change, but what about the demographic? What about the stakeholder? If the stakeholder is changing, maybe this is having an effect on the test score. And so the boundaries are changing, perhaps. Lots of things to consider here, and a very complex analysis is required by experts. Nevertheless, don't be overwhelmed by this if you're doing this for the first time. It seems complicated, but it's important, again, that you use experts who know what they're talking about, who know the CFR levels, who know the test specifications, so they know the test. They know how to differentiate between B1 and B2. They've gone through those descriptors and they're able to align them. The panel are in agreement as well of what is that minimally competent candidate. So you give them 20 scripts, for example, 20 scripts from A2 level candidates, and they rank order them into what is at the bottom of the A2 or where they put them. Is it A2? In fact, you don't even tell them they're A2. You ask them to come up with a CFR level. The panel then, the responses come together, and we'll look at those in a moment. Okay, so as we've moved through now, standard setting, you've done the workshop, and now you've got the results coming through. There are some things that you need to look at, and please don't be scared by the terminology here. It's really fairly straightforward things that you can look at. Of course, you can move to more complex statistics as well, but isn't necessary if you're doing this on a small scale, or it depends on your who you are and what you're doing. So you need to look at what's called the IntraJudge Consistency. Okay, this is where the judge, let's take one judge, Judge A, let's say Darren, has been marking consistently. Now, how do you do this? Well, you can give them scripts, the same script, maybe 2 or 3 times throughout the workshop, and see if they actually are able to mark it the same. Because they're looking at lots of different things, they possibly won't remember what they gave the first time. And so you'll look at the consistency between the 1 or 2 or 3 outcomes of that item. And you could look at this across a few. You could also look at the harshness of the marker as well. So you could see, or how lenient they are compared to the rest. And perhaps, and it does happen, even with the experts that we have at Cambridge, what happens is sometimes that the judges are not required to be part of the final results because they don't have consistency. They're not consistently marking as they should. I mean, this is for standard setting and for assessment of writing and speaking and with normal tests anyway. What you want is an assessor to assess correctly and consistently. So those ones that don't, you let them go, but not too many though. Otherwise you have to start again. And that's, I come right back to the beginning when I said, yes, you can have 15 to 30 people in the panel, but they must be experts and they must be very, very good at what they do. But you are going to get some people who are not so good or having a bad day. And that does happen, of course. And you need to drop those off when you're considering the final score. Okay, you then need to look at what's called IntraJudge Consistency. So the intra was one person against himself or herself. The inter is one person against another. And this is where you investigate whether they agree with each other in their judgments. And again, that's also very important. What to do with those outcomes? Well, that depends on the outcome, doesn't it? If none of the judges are consistent, then what's wrong with that? Well, either the familiarization stages haven't been run properly, so they're not familiar with the CFR, with the test items, with the methodology, with everything that they should know, or more worryingly, that there's something wrong, particularly with the outcome or the write-in, for example, script, and the task itself is listing different things. So, but look at the task. This would be one thing to look at. To get one task, let's say writing, one task type, and it's the same task, and you've got, say, 30 different write-ins, and then you compare those 30 write-ins for each of the 30 expert on the panel, for example, and then you get some good stats back on how consistent they are and whether they are in agreement with each other. There are stats to do with agreement, of course, and I'll just, in the next slide, talk about those very briefly. But yes, that's something that's obviously you need to do. Yep, you need to look at the stability of the results as well. And this is the kind of standard error of the cutoffs. Standard error is the kind of range from where it should be. And that, a high standard error is not very good. So you want a low standard error for the cutoffs. And then you look at the accuracy and consistency of the classification based on the standard setting. So pretty much all of above there, you're just looking at how valid the result is, you're looking at the accuracy, and you're making a judgment of whether this standard setting procedure, this alignment to the CFR, has been successful or not. It may be that it's not been successful. And so then you have to go back and rework it again. It does all depend, though, on the outcomes. And if you're happy with the outcomes, then you can move on. You do, though, have to be transparent. You have to report this. Otherwise, what's the point? Yeah. So you're doing this for a reason, and normally it is to ensure the validity of the test scores and to align to the CFR so that people are aware of what your score means on the common European scale, the CFR, okay? So everybody's aware of what A2 is, but they may not know what 58 is in your score. But if you can map those two, if you can align those two, that's the cutoff, as we do at Cambridge, then you have very good standards, and people find your tests valid and reliable, and you have accountability, and you are responsible for producing reports to make this transparent, and people can pick up this data on the internet from your website and make decisions about whether to trust your test score or not. You can imagine when you get to IELTS and other such tests, high stakes tests, that this becomes really, really important. Very high stakes, and has a consequence for the stakeholder involved. Okay, so I just want to briefly look at some of the stats that you can do here. And we're going to look at kind of the intra one, where we look at the comparison between a judge and another judge. And here you can see in the top table, we have judge 1 versus judge 2. And basically what you do is you say what the score is, and you kind of, as you can see, put the numbers in like so, and you can see the exact, or the kind of the agreement is down through the diagonal of the table there. So 7, 10, 12, and 7, they got correct across A1, A2, B1, and B2. Okay, so that's their agreement of the things that they agreed on, and then outside of that, you can see how far out they were as well. And so the easy calculation there is just to add those up and then divide by the total. So 36 divided by 50, and you get 0.72 kind of score here. Now, that's not great. You would expect in standard setting, when you're looking at gold standard experts, you would expect 85 to 90. So maybe this is a bad example to show you, but you would want something a lot higher than that when they have exact agreement, especially, I would say, when you're looking at whole levels of A1, A2. Now you can break that down into component parts. You could break it down into lower A1, middle A1, and higher A1, and then look at the agreement scores there between them as well. Depends how accurate or precise you want your examiners to be, or your items to be, to cut, to set the cut scores here. So that's also quite important. But you can also do something called an adjacent agreement calculation, which looks at the distance between not the exact, but the ones next to the adjacent scores. So you can see here that what you do is you take that 36 that we just did in the previous calculation, and you add 9 to it. Well, the 9 comes from the scores which are next to the scores in the table. So 7 is the exact score, 2 is the one which is adjacent. So you take the 2, and then the next 2, and the next 2, so that's 6. And then the below the exact, you've got 1, 2, and 0. So you've got 6, 7, 8, 9. So 36 plus 9, and then divide it by the total, which is 50 items in total. And then you get the 0.90. That's better in an adjacent agreement. In language, as an examiner and standard setting and standardization, you would be looking at 0.9 as, like I said, as a good score to be getting here. And you would look at adjacent scores. You want examiners to be within one CFR band of each other. Normally for examiners who are used across the world. But again, with standard setting, you really want the creme de la creme. So you can say that this is the level. So you can see you may think, well, this is a bit kind of or hit and miss, or how does this work? And this isn't very precise. But I think it does come back and it does illustrate that teachers are key to understanding what is a CFR level. Teachers are key to assessment. They know what is a CFR level. They know what, these judges, let's call them teachers, even better. What is an A2? What is a B1? They know those differences and are able to unpick those differences. And so they are central and key to everything. If you have these kind of teachers working for you, you can do standard setting, and therefore you can align your tests to the CFR or any other framework which you may wish to do. So on this final slide, I just want to look at what we do at Cambridge University Press and Assessment. We have a range of assessment products that we standardize, as you can well imagine. In fact, all of our products are standardized, and we have alignment to the CFR. On the left-hand side, you can see the CFR grades there, pre-A1 through to C2. Next to that, we've aligned the Cambridge English Scale score to the CFR, so that's nicely mapped. And we have a score system now running from like 140 to 160 is 1, and etc. Then you have a nice illustration of all of our exams and the cutoffs. You can see the cutoffs are a lot of them. So let's take, for example, B2 first in the middle here, and you can see the cutoff there is at 160 at the bottom of grade C. And then you've got boundaries, grade boundaries moving up from that, from grade B and grade A. We have what's called upward and downward certification, where there's that overlap with the step-by-step approach. So grade A's move into the next level, and the student there has demonstrated the next level up, although they're not really at that CFR level, but they have demonstrated capability for the next level, or conversely at the level below. This has obviously taken a lot of time over the years, and I think this one diagram illustrates that we have undertaken thorough research. We have test specifications, we have validation documents, we have alignment to the CFR, we have alignment to other frameworks such as the Chinese Scale of English, CSE. We have alignment to and maps to other external tests as well. At Cambridge, we like to look at the quality of our tests. We are, of course, a not-for-profit organization, so we want to ensure that the quality of our assessments are at the highest possible standards, and so any kind of money which comes back into the company is injected back into improving the quality of our tests, so that you, the stakeholder, can use this test score to, for whatever purpose it may be, immigration or university entrance or whatever, or just for personal gain and personal development. So, well, hopefully today I've shown you that that assessment and aligning to the CFR is a tricky, complex, and time-consuming process. However, not out of the reach of anyone really, and it's something that you can do. You have to ask yourself the question, I think, what quality do I want at the end of it? So that will then answer kind of your questions around how many experts do I need on the panel, which experts do I need on the panel, what familiarization activities do I need to do with the panel, do we have test specifications written for us, our test? So if not, let's write them. Let's standardize that panel as well to make sure they're all consistent, and then look at the stats of those experts and maybe drop some off who are not so consistent. Run the the actual standardization or the alignment to the CFR for each of the skills that you want to look at, and from there you can then report that your tests are at a particular CFR level, and reports and the method, and people will accept, and you have to show this what's called evidence, this validity evidence, and it's central to everything that we do in language assessments. Okay, well, thank you very much. Like I said, I hope you've enjoyed today, and I'm sorry that I haven't been able to be here today with you in person, and I hope that that we meet soon and I'm able to possibly talk to you face to face. And if you have any questions, I'm open to having a conversation with anyone who wants to talk about language assessments, alignment to CFR, or any topics related to, in fact, recognition, assessment, and pedagogy, which I'm responsible for in your region. Okay, thank you very much, and goodbye.